during Huey's reign, there was no relationship with Roosevelt. Very little federal money or programs entered Louisiana during the early part of the New Deal. Huey had announced he was going to run for president. Even before that, he was very anti-Roosevelt. His meetings with Roosevelt were horrific, where he actually insulted the president. He took his straw hat and leaned over and was tapping the president, calling him Frank. No one called him Frank, but tapping him on his legs, which were paralyzed. Which I think it might have been Moley who was there with him. It was one of the brain trust who were just apoplectic. And Roosevelt just sat there and smiled, but you know inside he was, you know, vengeance was going to come later. No, Huey really retarded any sort of New Deal support. But then, right after he was shot and killed, his vacuum was replaced by, as I mentioned earlier, the hordes of extremely corrupt politicians. And that was called the Second New Deal. They went to Washington with their hands out and were building projects, corrupt building projects. The LSU campus, people went to jail right and left for years later of those New Deal monies being misspent. As far as the relationship with women's programs, you know, I mean, Louisiana doesn't have a civil service commission in force until the mid-1950s. So it's political, it's courthouse gang. So women were left behind, and African-American women way behind that.
So how about you, both with women in general and with black women in particular in the New Deal?
Well, I mean, just one quick response to what Richard just said. I think the name I heard applied to that period you're talking about is not Second New Deal, it's the Second Louisiana Purchase.
That's right.
When the federal government just tried to buy support in Louisiana by pumping a lot of money in.
Good question.
Yeah. But look, the question, in a sense, your question reads back into an earlier era, a kind of a sensibility and a political calculus that really isn't there until much later, until I'd say the 1960s at the earliest, when, as a society, we begin to think of policy and politics in categories that have to do explicitly with race or gender. That just wasn't the way people thought in those days when they started thinking about policy. They thought in terms of economic sectors. So there's federal policies that are targeted specific on agriculture or on organized labor, but the gender and race dimension of that really doesn't come into sharp focus. That's really a post-World, that kind of identity politics, we call it. That's really a kind of a post-World War II development.
Down.
In the shipyards in Alabama during World War II, there were many African-American males and females that were being employed there. And the government was building housing for the people that were coming in to work in the shipyards. And it was so disproportionate, so many for the whites and so little for the African-Americans. It was just, and then once the African-Americans became welders, the race riots started, you know, within the shipyards, and then they had to, it's just the violence, and it just seemed like the government could have done, you know, I mean, it just seems like the government should have stepped in more and taken more of a role in the Alabama shipyards.
I don't know who's worked on the Alabama shipyards.
That's an episode that I don't know much about. I mean, the famous race riots are in Detroit and Los Angeles during the war. The fact there were race riots in Alabama, that's I don't know much about that.
Please. James, is that right?
James, yeah. In your book, chapter 10 about Huey, it said that he was leaving. He had, of course, I know he had aspirations to run for president himself, and that he was going to spearhead Roosevelt's campaign. Was that more of an effort to just get his own name out there? Did he actually have?
They were using each other, and both of them told their staffs they were using the other guy for their own experience. Roosevelt said that there were really only two men he feared: Douglas MacArthur on the right, and Huey Long on the left. So even from the start, there was absolutely no trust between the two. But Roosevelt needed the South. Huey needed Roosevelt's national exposure.
They were both playing each other.
Absolutely. And as soon as, and that marriage did not last long at all. As soon as Huey got in the Senate and felt he did not need Roosevelt, he had the Senate as a national platform, they were gone.
How much did after the first New Deal, and when you say the second 100 days, the second New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt decided to try to change the Supreme Court. What impact did that have on him politically when he went as far to, we talked about the possibility of, could you ever see another person rise to that prominency of taking control over a state, more or less. But when you start looking at presidents trying to sway the Supreme Court to determine whether or not something is legal or constitutional, how much did that actually damage Roosevelt's political side?
So the court packing plan, and maybe you want to review the facts of it.
Well, reviewing the facts of the 1937 court planning episode actually takes us back to the 19th century. Because the Constitution does not specify how many justices sit on the Supreme Court. The numbers varied over many, many years. It's been 5, 7, now it's 9. We think of 9 as something that's written in Holy Scripture somewhere, but it's not actually, it can be changed. And there's an episode in the immediate post-Civil War period when, in order to get the guarantee that the court would not peel back a piece of legislation having to do with gold redemption of government bonds, I remember, Ulysses Grant added 2 people to the Supreme Court in order to protect that policy, and that wasn't thought to be terribly disruptive. And it passed, and then the court had 9, I think that's when it went to 9, I'm not absolutely sure. But the point is, it's other presidents have altered the composition of the court. And we know in our own time that who gets appointed to the court is a political matter. I mean, it's not these guys aren't completely dispassionately severed from all the controversies of their time. But what made the 37 episode so, use a phrase, a word was used earlier this morning, so catalytic, is that it came on the heels of one thing, and it was paralleled by a second thing. Came on the heels of this overwhelming electoral victory that Roosevelt had in 1936, which both gave him, I think, a shot of overconfidence and really alerted his adversaries out there in the country that this guy is on the verge of accumulating a lot of power. And in that context, the effort to change the composition of the court looked particularly ominous. It was also accompanied, this episode is largely forgotten, but it was also accompanied by a deliberate campaign of Roosevelt's to purge the Democratic Party of its most conservative members, and particularly a rather famous episode involving a senator from Georgia named Walter George. And there's an episode where Roosevelt gets on the platform with Walter George in Georgia and says, this guy, this Democratic senator of my party from your state is not supporting the New Deal. He's no kind of liberal. Get rid of him. And here's the senator sitting there on the platform. So all this seemed to a lot of people to add up to a concerted effort on Roosevelt's part to really consolidate power. It would be too much, it would be an exaggeration to say in the model of Huey Long, but it looked to a lot of people that way. So the Supreme Court packing episode has to be understood in that context. There are other things going on simultaneously. And most historians who have looked at this think that all by itself, the effort to change the composition of the court, actually it wasn't that novel an idea and it wasn't that outrageous, but in this context it really excited a lot of opposition. So most people, as I say, conclude it wasn't the thing that stopped the New Deal, but it became the catalyst for putting together something called the Conservative Coalition, which was Republicans and Southern Democrats who made common cause in 1937, 1938, and right finish to the whole New Deal program. There's really only one piece of legislation after 1936 that has any New Deal flavor. Is the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. There's nothing else. Roosevelt, 1942,